The Coastal Club, October 14th. The air burns with the scent of expensive lilies and old betrayals. My name is Beatrice Hamilton, and I am standing in the dark watching the golden glow of a wedding where my absence is the guest of honor. Inside, they are toasting to a version of the truth that paints me as the villain, but I am holding the receipts that prove who really built this kingdom. I am not running away this time. I am walking toward the light, toward the music, toward the people who tried to break me, ready to show them that the truth does not stay buried forever. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The salt air off the marina usually smelled like freedom, but tonight it smelled like $300,000 of wasted money and old rotting lies. I stood in the shadow of a sprawling oak tree just outside the perimeter of the manicured lawn, watching the valet drivers jog back and forth to park cars that cost more than most people's houses. The string lights hung in the trees like captured stars, casting a soft golden glow over the people I had spent my entire childhood trying to please. I could hear the faint, polite laughter drifting on the wind, the clinking of crystal flutes, and the low hum of a string quartet playing something aggressively classical. It was a perfect scene, a masterpiece of social engineering designed to tell the world that the Hamilton family was royalty. And like any kingdom, they had strict borders. I was currently standing on the wrong side of them. My phone buzzed in my clutch, a sharp vibration against my palm. I looked down the screen, illuminating my face in the darkness. It was a text message from my mother, Elaine. It was short, precise, and devoid of any warmth, her signature style. "Don't come. You don't belong to this family anymore. Please don't make a scene." I stared at the glowing pixels until they blurred. There was no anger in the text, just a cold, clinical dismissal. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact. To them, I wasn't a daughter or a sister. I was a liability that had been written off the ledger. I looked back up at the glittering venue, at the security guards checking names on a clipboard with the seriousness of Secret Service agents. The worst part wasn't the exclusion. The worst part was knowing that if I walked away right now, they wouldn't feel a shred of guilt. They meant it. They had surgically removed me from their lives, and tonight was the celebration of their successful operation. Growing up, I was never the daughter they wanted. In the Hamilton household, love was a transaction. You purchased affection with compliance. My brother Bryce, the groom, the golden child, the prince of the hour, understood this economy perfectly. He traded his autonomy for their approval, becoming a hollow vessel for my father's ego and my mother's social ambitions. I was the difficult one, the glitch in the programming. I was the one who asked questions they didn't want to answer, the one who refused to smile when I was angry, the one who eventually packed a bag and moved 3 hours away to build a life that didn't require a permission slip. They called it rebellion. I called it survival. But the real break, the wound that had festered into the scar tissue I was touching tonight, happened 3 years ago. It wasn't a screaming match or a dramatic exit. It was a piece of paper. My father, Robert, had sat me down in his mahogany-paneled study and slid a loan document across the desk. He wanted me to co-sign a massive high-risk loan for a business venture. Bryce was launching a venture that I knew after 5 minutes of looking at the financials was a sinkhole. They needed my credit, my clean record, because they had already leveraged everything else. When I refused, when I told them I wouldn't set my own future on fire to keep Bryce warm, the silence in that room was deafening. That refusal became my original sin. It was the betrayal they never forgave. They didn't see a daughter protecting her livelihood. They saw a traitor refusing to pay tribute. The stakes tonight were higher than just a missed party. This wasn't a backyard barbecue, it was a coronation. Bryce's wedding to Samantha was the Hamiltons' way of announcing to their high society circle that the dynasty was secure. The venue was a historic coastal resort, the kind of place where memberships are inherited, not bought. The guest list was a who's who of local power players, investors, and friends who were really just business contacts in tuxedos. By not inviting me, my parents were making a public declaration. In their world, absence was a language. My empty seat wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated smear campaign. I hadn't even known the date until this morning. I found out the same way strangers did, through a tagged photo on a cousin's Instagram story showing the rehearsal dinner. The caption read, "The family all together for the big day." I had zoomed in on the photo, looking at the faces of aunts and uncles who used to send me birthday cards, people who were now raising toasts to my exclusion. That was the moment the nausea hit. It wasn't just that I wasn't invited. It was the narrative they had constructed to explain my absence. I knew with a sickening certainty what they were telling people. I was unstable. I was struggling. I was ungrateful. They were painting me as the tragic broken failure so that my success, my actual hard-won independent success, wouldn't threaten their carefully curated reality. I felt a hand gently touch my elbow, grounding me. I turned to see Noah standing beside me in the shadows. Noah Sterling didn't look like the kind of man who owned half the skyline in the neighboring city, and that was exactly how he liked it. He was wearing a dark, perfectly tailored suit, but he wore it with the ease of someone who didn't need the armor. He wasn't a Hamilton-style patriarch who used money as a bludgeon. He was quiet, disciplined, and possessed an integrity that felt almost alien compared to the people inside that ballroom. We had met 2 years ago while volunteering for a disaster relief legal clinic, me handling the paperwork, him quietly writing checks that kept the lights on without ever asking for a plaque on the wall. He had been watching me stare at the venue for the last 5 minutes, saying nothing, just letting me process the cruelty of it all. We had kept our relationship quiet mostly because I refused to be someone's accessory again. I didn't want to be Noah Sterling's girlfriend. I wanted to be Beatrice Hamilton, a woman who stood on her own 2 feet. He respected that. He respected me. He was the first man I'd ever met who seemed to love my strength rather than fear it. "You don't have to do this, B," Noah said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the noise of the distant party. "We can get in the car. We can go to that diner you like, get fries, and forget these people exist." I looked at him, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes. He wasn't trying to save me. He was offering me a choice. That was the difference. My family demanded submission. Noah offered options. He knew the history. He knew about the loan refusal. He knew about the time I drained my savings account to pay for Bryce's legal fees after a misunderstanding with a rental car, only to have Bryce call me cheap for not booking him a better hotel during the court hearing. Noah knew it all, and he was still standing here. "If I leave," I said, my voice trembling slightly before I clamped down on it, "it proves them right. If I disappear, I'm confirming everything they've told people. I'm the crazy one. I'm the one who can't handle family obligations. I become the ghost they want me to be." I looked back at the entrance. The valet was opening the door of a Bentley for a couple I recognized, old friends of my parents, who used to pinch my cheeks when I was 5. They walked toward the light, oblivious to the fact that the daughter of the house was standing in the dark. My mother's text message burned in my mind. "You don't belong to this family anymore." It was true. I didn't belong to their version of family, a version built on manipulation, silence, and shiny surfaces covering deep rot. But I did belong to myself, and I refused to let them use my absence to cement their lies. I wasn't going to let them weaponize my silence any longer. "I'm not going in there to make a scene," I told Noah, straightening my spine. I adjusted the strap of my bag, feeling the cold metal of the buckle. "I'm going in there to exist. They think they can erase me because I stopped playing their game. They think because I didn't sign their loans or cover their tracks, I lost my seat at the table." Noah nodded slowly. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He adjusted his cufflinks, his face settling into a mask of calm resolve. He was technically a guest, an invitee through a corporate sponsorship connection to the bride's father. He had an invite. I did not. But he wasn't going to walk in there as a CEO tonight. He was walking in as my partner, even if they didn't know it yet. "Ready?" he asked. "No," I admitted. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every instinct ingrained in me from childhood was screaming at me to run, to hide, to apologize for taking up space. But then I thought of Bryce, smug and protected. I thought of my father's disappointed scowl. I thought of my mother's text. I took a breath, letting the salty air fill my lungs one last time before stepping into the perfume cloud of the event. "Let's go," I said. I started walking toward the light, my heels clicking on the pavement with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. I wasn't there to crash a wedding. I was there to stop letting them write my story. The walk from the parking lot to the entrance was only 50 yards, but it felt like walking across a minefield. The gravel crunched loudly under my heels, a stark contrast to the smooth, silent arrival of the luxury sedans gliding up to the valet stand. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a physical betrayal of the calm facade I was fighting to maintain. I kept my head high, fixing my gaze on the arched doorway, where a team of event staff in black vests held iPads, acting as the gatekeepers to the Hamilton kingdom. I reached the front of the line. The heavy scent of jasmine and expensive cologne was suffocating. A young woman with a headset looked up, her smile practiced and bright. "Welcome name, please. Beatrice Hamilton," I said, my voice steady. She tapped on her screen, scrolled, and then tapped again. The smile faltered just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. The glitch. "I'm sorry I don't see a Beatrice Hamilton on the guest list. Are you a +1? "I'm the groom's sister," I said. It was a simple biological fact, yet saying it felt like uttering a dirty word in church. The woman's eyes widened slightly. She looked over her shoulder, signaling to an older woman with a clipboard who was directing traffic. I recognized her immediately. Mrs. Higgins. She had coordinated my 16th birthday party back when I was still trying to be the daughter they wanted. She had seen the cracks in the family portrait years before anyone else. Mrs. Higgins walked over, her face tightening as she recognized me. She didn't look hostile, just weary. She knew the script. She knew I wasn't supposed to be here. "Beatrice," she said, her voice lowered to a professional whisper, "your mother was very specific about the list." "I know, Mrs. Higgins," I replied, keeping my hands clasped in front of me so she wouldn't see them shaking. "I'm not here to cause a scene. I'm not here to scream or throw things. I just want 5 minutes. 5 minutes to wish my brother well, and then I'll leave. Please." It was a gamble. I was banking on her small-town decency, on the fact that she had known me since I was a child with braces. She looked at the security guard hovering nearby, then back at me. She saw a woman standing alone, dressed appropriately, speaking calmly. She didn't see the unstable monster my parents had described. "5 minutes," she murmured, stepping aside just enough to clear the path. "Stay near the back. If there's trouble, I have to do my job, Beatrice." "Thank you," I breathed. I stepped through the archway and into the courtyard. The transformation was instant. The humid coastal air was replaced by the climate-controlled breeze of the resort's grand atrium. It was beautiful, objectively speaking. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen rain. A jazz band played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne. But beneath the glamour, I could feel the tension radiating off the people I recognized. I hadn't made it 10 feet before the air shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a presence. I turned to see my mother Elaine gliding toward me. She was wearing a floor-length gown of silver silk, her hair coiffed into an indestructible helmet of blonde perfection. She was smiling, nodding at guests as she passed, playing the role of the gracious hostess. But as she closed the distance between us, her eyes were dead. They were 2 chips of ice in a warm room. She stopped 2 feet from me, angling her body so that to anyone watching we looked like a mother and daughter sharing a private moment. "You have some nerve," she hissed, the smile never leaving her lips. "I told you explicitly, you are not welcome here." "Hello, Mother," I said, refusing to shrink. "It's nice to see you too." "Don't you dare play the victim," she snapped, keeping her voice low enough to blend with the music. "You don't get to show up and pretend you're one of us. You made your choice. You chose to leave. You chose to embarrass us." "I chose to not sign a fraudulent loan," I corrected quietly. That's not the same thing. It is in this family. A deep voice rumbled from behind her. My father, Robert, stepped up beside her. He looked older than I remembered, his face ruddier, the lines around his mouth etched deeper by stress and scotch. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket, looking at me with a mixture of disappointment and disgust that I had memorized by the time I was 12. You chose your life, Beatrice, he said, holding a tumbler of whiskey. You wanted to be independent, fine. You got it. But you don't get to come back here and eat our food and drink our wine when you couldn't be bothered to help this family when it mattered. You're a taker. That's all you've ever been. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. A taker. I had worked 2 jobs in college so I wouldn't have to ask them for rent money. I had built a career in logistics from the ground up without a single phone call from them to open a door. I'm not here for your food, Dad, I said. Then why are you here? It was Bryce. My brother materialized from the crowd, looking every inch the golden boy in his custom-fitted tuxedo. But up close, the cracks showed. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements twitchy. He held a glass of champagne like a weapon. He had always been handsome, but cruelty had started to warp his features, making him look sharp and predatory. Look at this, Bryce sneered, gesturing at me with his glass. The prodigal sister returns. What happened, B? Did you run out of cash? Did your little independent life fall apart? Congratulations, Bryce, I said, ignoring the jab. I came to say congratulations. Save it. He laughed, a harsh barking sound. You're an embarrassment. You're a freeloader who couldn't make it in the real world, so now you're here for attention. You want everyone to look at poor, sad Beatrice. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of expensive liquor and nervousness. Well, nobody cares. I have real people here tonight. Important people. I'm connected now, B. Big time. I've got guys here who run companies you dream about working for. I don't need you dragging down the room. The urge to apologize rose in my throat like bile. It was a reflex, a phantom limb from a childhood spent trying to de-escalate their anger. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you, I'll leave. The words were right there, ready to be spilled. I looked around the room. I saw the way their smiles didn't reach their eyes. I saw the way the guests were essentially props in their stage play. I smelled the roses, sickly sweet, masking the rot. No, the voice in my head whispered. Not this time. I swallowed the apology. I looked Bryce in the eye. I'm happy for you, Bryce. I really am. Just get out, he spat, before I have security drag you out. My parents turned their backs on me, a synchronized movement of dismissal, and guided Bryce back toward a group of wealthy investors. I was left standing alone in the middle of the cocktail hour, feeling like I had been stripped naked. I moved toward the edge of the room, my hands shaking. I needed water. I needed air. Here. A soft voice and a cold glass appeared at my elbow. I turned to see my cousin Lila. She was the only person in the family who hadn't blocked my number, though we rarely spoke because her mother, my Aunt Marcy, was terrified of Elaine's wrath. Lila looked terrified now, darting glances around the room to make sure no one saw her consorting with the enemy. Drink, she whispered. You look like you're going to pass out. I took the water and downed half of it in one gulp. Thanks, Lila. They're awful, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. I heard what Bryce said. You don't deserve that, B. You don't have to earn basic decency. You're his sister. It's okay, I said, though it wasn't. Why did you come? She asked, her eyes wide. You knew they'd be like this. I touched my clutch bag. Inside, tucked into a hidden pocket, was a flash drive. But more importantly, on my phone, backed up to 3 different cloud servers, was the truth. The receipts. They weren't vague accusations. They were concrete anchors I had been gathering for 3 years, not out of malice, but out of necessity. I thought about them now, grounding myself in the reality of what I held. First, the emails. Dozens of them from my father. If you don't sign this co-sign agreement, you are cut off. We will consider you a stranger. threats of disownment that were explicitly transactional. Second, the legal document, the one I refused to sign. It was a loan application for Bryce's first failed startup, but my father had falsified the income statements and listed me as a guarantor without my initial consent. If I had signed that, I would have been on the hook for $500,000 of debt when the business inevitably imploded 6 months later. My refusal hadn't just saved my credit score, it had saved me from bankruptcy. And third, the nuclear option. The voicemail. I could hear it playing in my head as clearly as if Bryce were standing next to me. It was from 6 months ago at 2:00 a.m. He was drunk, crying, panicking. "B, you have to help me. I moved the money. I thought I could put it back before the audit, but I can't. Dad says if I can't fix it, he's going to. Look, if you just say you borrowed it, they won't press charges against you. They know you're struggling. Please. I can't go to jail. I'm the heir, B. You're nobody. Just take the hit for me." He wanted me to confess to embezzlement I didn't commit. He wanted me to be the scapegoat for his crime because he viewed my life as disposable. That was the reality of the Hamilton family love. "I came because I'm done hiding," I told Lila. Before she could respond, a commotion stirred near the center of the room. The cocktail hour was transitioning to the reception and the crowd was moving. I tried to blend into the flow, but luck was not on my side. "Excuse me." It was Bryce's voice amplified by the acoustics of the atrium. He was standing near the photographer, his face flushed. He pointed a finger directly at me across the room. The chatter died down. Heads turned. "She's not supposed to be here," Bryce announced, his voice cracking with entitlement. "She's not invited. She's not family." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Guests stared. A few whispered behind their hands. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, that old familiar shame washing over me like dirty water. It was the nightmare scenario: public rejection, the finger pointed, the crowd judging. My mother stepped forward, not to de-escalate, but to twist the knife. She signaled to a waiter, pointing at me, as if I were a stray dog that had wandered in from the street. "Please escort her out," she said loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "She's clearly unwell." Unwell. There it was, the narrative. I looked at the waiter, a young kid who looked terrified. I looked at the crowd. I felt the shame try to buckle my knees, try to make me run out the door crying so they could shake their heads and say, "See? We told you she was unstable." No. I straightened my spine. I didn't move toward the door. I didn't move toward the waiter. I just stood there, anchoring myself to the floor. Not today. "I'll leave when I've said my piece to the bride," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. Bryce opened his mouth to scream something else, probably an insult that would haunt him later, but he was cut off by a shift in the room's atmosphere. It was subtle at first, a ripple of whispers turning into a hush of recognition near the main entrance. The heavy double doors swung open, and Noah Sterling walked in. He wasn't wearing a cape. He didn't burst in with sirens. He simply walked into the room with the kind of quiet, absolute confidence that sucks the oxygen out of a space. He was the CEO of Sterling & Co., a man whose face had been on the cover of Forbes last month, a man whose investment firm practically owned the coastal real estate market. He paused at the top of the stairs, scanning the room. He wasn't looking for the bar. He wasn't looking for the groom. The Hamiltons froze. My father's jaw literally dropped. He had been trying to get a meeting with Noah Sterling's VP for 3 years and had never even gotten a call back. Now the man himself was standing at his son's wedding. Bryce's anger evaporated, replaced instantly by a desperate, fawning look that was painful to watch. He practically tripped over himself to get to the foot of the stairs. "Mr. Sterling," Bryce called out, his voice pitching up an octave. We didn't know you were coming. What an honor. Truly." My mother smoothed her dress, her unwell daughter narrative forgotten in the face of true power. "Mr. Sterling, welcome. We are so delighted." Noah didn't smile. He didn't shake Bryce's extended hand. He walked down the stairs, his movements fluid and precise. He was a corporate guest. Yes. His firm had sponsored the preservation trust that owned this venue, but he wasn't here for the architecture. He looked past Bryce. He looked past my father. He looked past the gaping guests. He saw me. I was standing near a pillar, isolated, the pariah of the evening. Noah's eyes locked onto mine. His face, usually so guarded, softened. It wasn't a look of pity. It was a look of recognition. And then, as he took in the scene, the finger-pointing brother, the flushed mother, the security guard hovering near me, his expression hardened into something colder than steel. He understood exactly what was happening. Bryce, oblivious to the dynamic, tried to recover. He stepped into Noah's line of sight, puffing out his chest. "I was just telling my father," Bryce lied, his voice loud enough for the nearby circle to hear, "that I've been consulting on the Sterling account. Practically running the division, really. We're going to do great things together, right?" It was a fatal mistake, a lie born of insecurity spoken to a man who valued truth above all else. Noah stopped. He looked at Bryce, then at my father, who was nodding along, desperate to claim proximity to power. "Is that so?" Noah asked. His voice was calm, but it carried across the room. "I wasn't aware we were working together." "Oh, well, you know, through the channels," Bryce stammered, sweating now. But, anyway, don't let us keep you. We were just handling a little family security issue, getting rid of the riffraff." He gestured vaguely in my direction, laughing nervously. "You know how it is. Some people just don't know their place." Noah didn't laugh. He didn't correct them yet. He just watched them. He collected the data. He saw Bryce bragging about expelling his own sister to impress a stranger. He saw the cruelty dressed up as social standing. Noah turned his head slowly and looked at me again across the expanse of the ballroom. The distance between us felt charged, electric. My family thought I was trash. They thought I was a failure who had crawled back for a handout. They thought they were impressing a billionaire while kicking me to the curb. They didn't know who I was anymore. And as Noah started walking not toward the VIP table, but toward me, I realized the sweetest, most terrifying truth of the night. They definitely didn't know who was about to stand beside me. The transition to the toasts was seamless, a choreographed shift in energy that the staff executed with military precision. Waiters appeared with fresh bottles of Dom Perignon, filling flutes until the room sparkled with effervescence. I stood frozen near the pillar, Noah's presence beside me, acting as a strange force field. He hadn't made his move yet. He was waiting, observing, letting the Hamiltons dig their hole just a little bit deeper. My mother Elaine took the microphone at the head table. She looked radiant under the stage lights, a vision of maternal pride that I knew was entirely manufactured. She tapped the mic, the feedback whining briefly before she settled into her performance. "If I could have everyone's attention," she cooed, her voice amplified to reach the back corners of the hall. "Tonight isn't just about Bryce and Samantha. It's about legacy. It's about the strength of family." I felt my stomach turn. I watched guests nod, captivated by her charm. "You see," Elaine continued, casting a loving gaze toward Bryce, "the Hamiltons have always believed that family is the only thing that matters. We sacrifice for each other. We protect each other. We stand together when the world tries to tear us apart. Bryce, you are the embodiment of that loyalty. You have carried the weight of this family's future with such grace." The rage that sparked in my chest wasn't hot. It was cold and clarifying. She was describing a family I had never met. She was talking about loyalty while standing 10 feet away from the daughter she had disowned for refusing to commit fraud. She was talking about protection while celebrating the son who had tried to frame me. "To the Hamiltons." She raised her glass, her eyes glistening with practiced tears. "May we always stand united." "Hear, hear," my father bellowed from his seat. The room began to murmur, assent, glasses rising. "I'd like to add a toast," a voice cut through the air. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shouted, it was simply projected with such absolute authority that it sliced through the applause like a razor. The room went silent. Noah Sterling stepped away from the pillar, moving out of the shadows and into the center of the floor. He didn't look at the head table yet. He looked at the guests, commanding the space with the natural gravity of a man who controlled billions of dollars in assets. My father blinked confused. Bryce looked like he had swallowed a lemon. They were paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance. "Why is the VIP guest interrupting? Mr. Sterling?" My mother asked, her smile faltering. "Did you want to say a few words?" "I do," Noah said smoothly. He walked until he was standing in the clear, open space between the guest tables and the bridal party. He turned to face Bryce, then my father. "I've been listening to a lot of stories tonight. Stories about success, stories about connections, stories about family loyalty." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Noah Sterling. I'm the CEO of Sterling and Company." A ripple of recognition went through the crowd. The whispers started. "That's him. That's the investor." Noah raised a hand, silencing them effortlessly. "And earlier tonight I was told by the groom that he was practically running a division of my company. I was told that this family values integrity above all else." Bryce's face went from pale to a sickly shade of gray. He started to stand up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Mr. Sterling, please, we can talk about business later." "This isn't business, Bryce," Noah said. His voice dropped an octave, losing its pleasant veneer. "This is personal. You told me you were removing the riffraff tonight. You told me some people don't know their place." Noah turned back to the pillar where I was standing. He extended a hand toward me. "I'd like to introduce you all to the reason I'm here. This is Beatrice Hamilton. She is the woman I love, she is my partner, and she is the only person in this room who understands the actual definition of integrity." The sound of the room inhaling was audible. The shockwave hit the head table physically. My mother dropped her champagne flute. It shattered on the dance floor, the crystal exploding, but no one looked at the mess. They were looking at me. They were looking at the unstable, they'd failed daughter being claimed by the most powerful man in the state. I saw the realization dawn on my father's face, the calculation of what he had just lost. I saw the terror in Bryce's eyes as his lie about knowing Noah crumbled in real time. But Noah didn't keep talking. He stepped back. He wasn't here to fight my battle. He was here to level the playing field so I could fight it myself. He looked at me, giving a small nod. "Your floor." I walked forward. My legs felt heavy, but my head was clear. I walked past the guests who had shunned me at the door. I walked until I was standing right in front of the head table, looking up at the people who had spent my entire life making me feel small. "You told everyone I was unstable," I said, my voice shaking slightly before finding its steel. "You told them I was ungrateful. You told them I left because I couldn't hack it in the real world." "Beatrice, stop this!" my father hissed, standing up. "You're making a scene." "No, Dad," I said louder this time. "I'm correcting the record. I didn't leave because I was weak. I left because 3 years ago you asked me to co-sign a loan for Bryce based on falsified income statements. You told me that if I didn't commit bank fraud to save the family image, I was no longer your daughter." A gasp went through the room. My mother's hands flew to her mouth. "She's lying," she shrieked to the guests. "She's always been a liar." "And 6 months ago," I continued, ignoring her, pulling my phone from my clutch. "When Bryce, the loyal son, got caught moving money he shouldn't have, he called me." I tapped the screen. I had the file queued up. I held the phone up to the microphone stand where my mother had just been preaching about sacrifice. The audio was clear. It was Bryce's voice, slurred and panicked, echoing through the ballroom speakers. "B, you have to help me. Dad says if I can't fix it, he's going to... Look, if you just say you borrowed it, they won't press charges against you. They know you're struggling. Please, I can't go to jail. I'm the heir, B. You're nobody. Just take the hit for me." I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was total. It was the silence of a tomb. Every guest, every waiter, every member of the band heard it. The heir begging the nobody to take the fall for a crime. Bryce sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. Samantha, the bride, stared at her new husband as if he had just grown a second head. I looked at my parents. They were stripped bare. There was no social grace that could cover this. There was no lie big enough to hide the ugliness they had nurtured. "You don't get to erase me and still use my name when it's convenient," I told them. "You don't get to call me a failure because I refuse to be your scapegoat." I turned to the room to the hundreds of staring eyes. "My mother talked about family being blood," I said. "But family isn't blood when blood is used like a chain. Real family doesn't ask you to destroy yourself to keep them warm. Real family doesn't love you only when you're useful." I looked toward the back of the room where my Aunt Marcy and Cousin Lila were sitting. Lila was crying, smiling, giving me a thumbs up. "There are good people in this family," I said softly. "People who loved me when I had nothing to offer but myself. I know who my family is." I turned back to Noah. He was watching me with a look of such intense pride that it made my chest ache. He wasn't looking at the crowd, he was only looking at me. He walked over, closing the distance between us, and took my hand. "I told you," Noah said, his voice carrying in the quiet room. "I'm not interested in their business. I'm interested in building something real." He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't get down on one knee that would have been theatrical, a performance for the audience. Instead, he stood tall, eye to eye with me, treating me as an equal. He opened a small velvet box. Inside was a ring that caught the light, elegant and distinct, nothing like the gaudy rocks my mother favored. "Beatrice," he said, "I've watched you build a life from scratch. I've watched you stand tall when anyone else would have folded. I don't want to save you. You don't need saving. I want to know if you'll build a family with me on purpose, a family where love isn't a debt you have to pay back." Tears finally spilled over hot and fast. This wasn't a rescue mission. He wasn't asking me to be his wife so I could hide behind his money. He was asking me to be his partner because he saw the woman I had fought to become. "Yes," I whispered. Then louder, "Yes." He slid the ring onto my finger. It fit perfectly. He pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in that building I felt safe. I wasn't being hidden, I was being seen. "She's confused." The shriek broke the moment. My mother was standing, her face a mask of desperate panic. She was gripping the tablecloth, her knuckles white. "Don't listen to her. She's having an episode, Beatrice, take that off. You're ruining your brother's day." She was trying to put the genie back in the bottle. She was trying to rewrite reality one last time. I pulled away from Noah gently and looked at her. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel fear. I looked at Elaine Hamilton, the woman who had given birth to me, the woman who had texted me, "Don't come," and I felt absolutely nothing. "I'm not confused, Elaine," I said, using her first name. It landed like a slap. "I've never been clearer." I looked at her like one looks at a stranger in a grocery store, someone you pass by without a second thought. That look, that total lack of emotional connection, hit her harder than any scream could have. She slumped back, realizing that her weapon was gone. She couldn't hurt me anymore because I didn't care enough to be hurt. I took Noah's hand again. "Let's go home." The silence that had gripped the ballroom didn't break all at once. It shattered in slow motion. As Noah and I turned to leave, the vacuum of sound was rushed by a sudden chaotic intake of breath from 300 guests. The atmosphere had shifted violently from a celebration of dynastic union to the uncomfortable intimacy of witnessing a public autopsy. I could feel the eyes on us, not the judgmental stares from the doorway, but looks of horrified fascination. The high society mask had slipped, and everyone was staring at the ugly, naked truth of the Hamilton family dynamics. I scanned the room as we walked, noticing the layers of reaction rippling through the crowd. The wealthy investors Bryce had been preening for looked disgusted, not at me, but at the situation. They were men who understood risk and liability, and they had just heard the groom admit to embezzlement on a recorded line. They were already pulling out their phones, likely texting their compliance officers or distancing themselves from any Hamilton-related ventures. Then there were the others, the neighbors, the old family friends who had known me since kindergarten. Some looked down at their plates, ashamed of their complicity. But a few, like Aunt Marcy, were sitting straighter, their eyes locking with mine in silent solidarity. But the most devastating reaction came from the head table. Samantha the bride was standing motionless. Her bouquet lay forgotten on the tablecloth. She wasn't looking at me, she was looking at Bryce. For the last year, she had been sold a version of him that was successful, wronged by his jealous sister and heir to a fortune. Now she was looking at a man who had begged his sister to go to jail for him. I saw her physically recoil as Bryce reached for her hand. She took a half step back, her white dress rustling softly, creating a chasm between them that no amount of wedding cake could fill. She had married a lie, and the realization was dawning on her with the weight of a tragedy. We hadn't made it halfway to the exit when the Hamiltons began to spiral. It was my father Robert who moved first. He didn't run to comfort his weeping wife or his exposed son. He scrambled around the table, knocking over a chair in his haste to intercept Noah. It was pathetic, really, the provider ego frantically trying to salvage the only currency he understood: status. "Mr. Sterling, Noah, please wait just a moment," my father panted, blocking our path near the cake table. His face was flushed, sweat beading on his forehead. He ignored me completely, his eyes fixed on Noah like a drowning man looking at a life raft. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding. She's emotional. You know how siblings are. But the business, the synergy we discussed, that's solid. We shouldn't let a family squabble affect a potential partnership." It was breathtakingly grotesque. Even now, with his son's crimes exposed and his daughter walking out, he was trying to close a deal. He thought he could negotiate his way out of humiliation. Noah stopped. He looked at my father with a calm, detached curiosity, like a scientist examining a particularly interesting bug. "Robert," Noah said, his voice level, "you seem to be under the impression that I'm still a potential investor." "Well, surely," my father stammered, forcing a terrified smile. "We're both businessmen. We know that emotions—" "I am a businessman," Noah interrupted, "which is why I don't do business with liabilities. And frankly, your lack of character is the biggest liability in this room." Before my father could respond, Bryce came charging toward us. He wasn't calculating like my father. He was pure, volatile id. He looked unraveled. His tie was crooked, his face contorted in a snarl that stripped away all his golden boy handsomeness. "You bitch!" Bryce screamed, lunging toward me. Noah stepped in front of me, not aggressively, but with the immovable presence of a wall. Bryce skidded to a halt, realizing he couldn't physically intimidate a man who was taller, broader, and infinitely more powerful than him. So Bryce did what he always did: he used words as shrapnel. "You think you've won," Bryce spat, pointing a shaking finger at me over Noah's shoulder. "You're nothing. You're just a jealous, vindictive little brat who couldn't stand seeing me happy. You ruined my wedding. You ruined everything because you're miserable." "I didn't ruin anything, Bryce," I said from behind Noah, stepping out so I could look my brother in the eye. "I just played your own voicemail. You ruined yourself the minute you decided I was disposable." "I hope you die alone," he screamed, his voice cracking, revealing the terrified child beneath the tuxedo. "Get out. You're not my sister. You're dead to us." From the head table, my mother began to wail. It was a theatrical, heaving sob designed to pull focus, to make herself the victim of the cruel daughter. "How could you?" she cried out to the room. "After everything we've done for you." Noah looked at Bryce, then at my father, and finally at my weeping mother. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten to destroy their credit ratings or buy their company just to dismantle it, even though I knew he could. That would have been cheap. It would have been engaging on their level. "We're leaving," Noah said, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel strike. "As for the threats and the slander, I suggest you stop. My legal team will be in touch regarding the harassment, any business matters." He paused, glancing at my father. "We'll address those through proper channels, but I wouldn't hold your breath. Tonight is personal." He put his hand on the small of my back, guiding me away from the wreckage. But I stopped. I had one last thing to say. Not to Bryce, who was beyond saving, and not to the guests. I needed to say it to the architects of this disaster. I turned to my parents. My father was staring at the floor, defeated not by the loss of his daughter, but by the loss of the deal. My mother was watching me through her fingers, checking to see if her tears were working. "You taught me something important," I said, my voice steady and clear in the hushed room. "You taught me that love was conditional. You taught me that I only mattered as long as I was useful or compliant." I looked at the wedding favors, the flowers, the facade of a happy family. "I'm done paying that price," I told them. "I'm defaulting on the debt you think I owe you." I turned away. I didn't run. I didn't cry. I walked out of the ballroom with my head high, the sound of my heels on the marble floor marking the cadence of my exit. I walked past the security guards, who looked at me with newfound respect, past the valet stand, and out into the cool night air. I wasn't fleeing a crime scene. I was choosing my own life. And for the first time in 28 years, the silence that followed me wasn't empty, it was peaceful. 6 months later, the silence in my life had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of things left unsaid in the Hamilton household. It was the rich, restorative silence of peace. I sat on the back porch of the small house Noah and I had bought together, not a mansion, but a home, watching the autumn leaves drift into the yard. The nervous system repair had been the hardest part. For weeks after the wedding, I would flinch when my phone buzzed, or wake up with my heart racing, waiting for the fallout. It took therapy, long walks along the coastline where the air felt clean and endless, quiet dinners with Noah to convince my body that the war was actually over. My phone lit up on the table, but I didn't jump. I picked it up and saw a photo from cousin Lila. She and Aunt Marcy were coming over for dinner on Sunday. They had stayed. That was the surprise I hadn't calculated. When the dust settled, the Hamilton family line hadn't severed completely. It had just been pruned. Aunt Marcy told me that the gossip circles had been vicious to my parents, but she didn't say it with glee. She just reported it as fact. The community had seen the truth, and for once the Hamilton money couldn't buy a better narrative. I opened my email to check on the project that had become my answer to their legacy. I hadn't used Noah's money to buy a yacht or a membership to the club that had rejected me. Instead, I had established the Hamilton Sterling Grant, a scholarship fund specifically for students who had lost financial support from their families due to lifestyle disagreements, a polite legal term for disownment. I wasn't doing it to flex wealth. I was doing it because I remembered being 22, eating ramen, and terrified that my refusal to sign a paper would cost me my future. I wanted to be the safety net I never had. A new notification slid across the top of my screen. The contact name made my stomach tighten for a microsecond before the new healthy pathways in my brain took over. It was a text from my mother. "Why are you doing this to us? People are still talking. It's cruel, Beatrice." I stared at the words. Even after 6 months after the exposure, after the silence, she still viewed my existence as something happening to her. She couldn't conceive of a world where I was the protagonist of my own life. In her mind, I was just a malfunctioning prop in hers. I didn't feel the need to explain. I didn't feel the need to argue or defend the recording I had played. I typed a simple response, my thumbs moving steady and sure. "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm finally doing something for me." I hit send, and then I blocked the number. It felt like closing a heavy iron door and locking it. I looked down at my hand resting on the porch railing. The engagement ring Noah had given me caught the afternoon light. It didn't look like a trophy or a shackle. It didn't carry the weight of obligation or the expectation of performance. It was just a ring, a symbol of a promise made between two people who chose each other freely. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp air, tasting the freedom that had cost me everything and nothing all at once. I realized then that my parents had accidentally given me a gift greater than any inheritance. Some families break you to keep you close. Mine broke me and accidentally set me free. And so Beatrice finally closed the chapter on the family that tried to erase her, choosing the quiet victory of self-respect over the loud tragedy of revenge. If you found yourself rooting for Beatrice in this battle for freedom, please make sure you hit that subscribe button. We read every single comment to hear your thoughts on her bold move. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.